In the rolling hills of western Georgia, 15 miles from the town of Cartersville, stands the crumbling remains of what was once the Pritchard plantation. Local historians have documented over 47 young women who traveled to this remote estate between 1842 and 1863, each believing they were about to begin their new life as a bride. Not one of them was ever seen again. The Pritchard family consisted of a patriarch, his wife, and 5 sons, all unmarried men well into their 30s who claimed to be searching for the perfect wives. What happened during those wedding nights remained buried in family records for over a century until a trunk discovered in 1987 revealed documents so disturbing that 3 separate historical societies refused to authenticate them. Tonight, we're going to uncover the truth about what really happened to those 47 women and why the Pritchard name was quietly erased from every official record in Bartow County. Before we continue with the story of the Pritchard plantation and its dark legacy, if you're fascinated by historical mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, let me know in the comments what state you're listening from tonight. Now, let's dive into this chilling tale that shocked even seasoned historians. The documents we're about to explore paint a picture so methodical and calculated that it defies comprehension. Yet every detail aligns perfectly with historical records from the antebellum South. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how it exploited the social vulnerabilities of young women in an era when marriage represented their only path to security and respectability. The year was 1842, and Georgia was experiencing an unprecedented economic boom driven by King Cotton's stranglehold on the global textile market. Cotton prices had reached historic heights of nearly 12 cents per pound, and wealthy plantation owners were expanding their operations across the fertile river valleys of northwest Georgia. Railroad construction was connecting previously isolated regions to major ports in Savannah and Charleston, creating new opportunities for those with vision and capital to exploit. It was during this time of prosperity that Cornelius Pritchard established his estate on nearly 3,000 acres of prime agricultural land along the serpentine banks of the Etowah River. The property, purchased for the substantial sum of $8,000 from a Virginia tobacco merchant facing bankruptcy, represented one of the most strategic landholdings in Bartow County. The Etowah River provided both irrigation for crops and transportation access to the broader Coosa River system, which connected ultimately to Mobile Bay and international shipping routes. Cornelius was a peculiar figure in the close-knit society of antebellum Georgia planters. Unlike his neighbors who flaunted their wealth with elaborate Greek revival mansions, lavish entertainments, and connections to Savannah's elite families, the Pritchard patriarch maintained a deliberate distance from local social hierarchies. He attended the Presbyterian Church in Cartersville with mechanical regularity, but never lingered for the extended conversations that typically followed Sunday services. His wife, Constance, was a pale, nervous woman who seemed to disappear into the shadows whenever visitors appeared at their door. Their 5 sons, Jeremiah, Obadiah, Ezekiel, Matthias, and Caleb, conducted their business with an efficiency that impressed even the most successful planters in the region. Yet they remained curiously detached from the social expectations that governed young men of their station. In a culture where masculine identity was closely tied to political involvement, military service, and social leadership, the Pritchard brothers showed little interest in any pursuits beyond their mysterious business ventures. What made the Pritchard men particularly notable was their apparent dedication to remaining bachelors well past the typical marrying age. In Southern society, where men of 22 were expected to secure wives from appropriate families and begin producing heirs to carry on plantation legacies, the Pritchard sons ranged from 28 to 36 years old in 1842. All remained unmarried, all claimed to be actively seeking ideal companions worthy of the family name. Yet none seemed to make any progress toward actual matrimony, despite their obvious wealth and social standing. The plantation itself was a marvel of organization and strategic isolation. The main house, constructed of locally quarried sandstone and imported heart pine, sat nearly 2 miles from the main road, accessible only by a winding path that crossed 3 wooden bridges over tributaries of the Etowah. This isolation, Cornelius often explained to curious neighbors, provided the perfect environment for serious agricultural pursuits without the distractions of constant social obligations that plagued more accessible properties. The house itself defied conventional plantation architecture. Rather than the typical central hall design, with rooms flowing into each other for social entertaining, the Pritchard mansion featured an unusual layout with multiple separate wings connected by covered walkways. Each wing could be completely sealed off from the others, and several rooms in the basement level had no windows and could only be accessed through heavy oak doors fitted with unusually robust iron locks. The Pritchard family employed an unusually small number of slaves for an estate of their size. Only 12 individuals who lived in quarters deliberately positioned nearly a mile from the main house, far beyond the typical proximity that allowed for efficient management of domestic activities. More intriguingly, they relied heavily on 3 white overseers: Tobias Hartwell, Duncan Lowry, and Silas Vance, men who had appeared in Bartow County around the same time as the Pritchards, and whose backgrounds remained mysteriously vague despite thorough questioning by neighboring plantation owners who prided themselves on knowing the pedigree of every family within 50 miles. Hartwell, a lean man with prematurely grey hair and hands that bore the calluses of someone familiar with both ropework and river navigation, claimed to have managed properties along the Savannah River before joining the Pritchards. Lowry, built like a blacksmith with arms that could easily restrain a struggling person, spoke with the accent of someone from the Tennessee Hill Country, but could never provide specific details about his previous employment. Vance, the youngest of the 3, had the quick eyes and nervous energy of someone accustomed to watching for trouble, and neighbors noted that he seemed more comfortable with weapons than with agricultural tools. During those first years, the Pritchards established themselves as reliable, if distant, members of the community. They attended the Methodist Church in Cartersville sporadically, contributed generously to local causes, including the construction of a new schoolhouse and road improvements, and maintained cordial relationships with other wealthy families. Their cotton crops consistently yielded impressive harvests, and their business dealings were conducted with a punctuality and attention to detail that earned respect from even the most demanding merchants in Atlanta and Savannah. However, close observers noted certain peculiarities in their behavior that would later prove significant. The sons frequently embarked on extended travels, sometimes lasting several months, always claiming to be exploring business opportunities or visiting distant relatives in Virginia, the Carolinas, or Tennessee. They never traveled together, maintaining a careful rotation that ensured at least 3 brothers remained on the plantation at all times. When they returned from these journeys, they often spoke enthusiastically about potential marriage prospects they had encountered, young ladies of good breeding who were considering their proposals. Local society matrons, always eager to facilitate appropriate matches for eligible bachelors, repeatedly offered to arrange introductions to suitable young women from established Georgia families. The Pritchard sons politely declined these overtures, explaining that their extensive travels had already provided them with numerous promising connections that simply required time and patience to develop properly. Mrs. Henrietta Cumberland, the unofficial social coordinator for Cartersville's elite families, later recorded in her diary that she found the Pritchard brothers' courtship methods peculiar and inefficient. Southern courtship traditions emphasized family connections, formal introductions, and elaborate social rituals that allowed both families to evaluate the suitability of proposed matches. The Pritchard approach of conducting solitary searches in distant locations struck her as both impractical and potentially dangerous to family reputation. The first documented case that would later be understood as part of a systematic pattern occurred in September 1843. Though historians now believe earlier incidents went completely unrecorded due to the family's careful selection of victims whose disappearance would generate minimal inquiry. Jeremiah Pritchard, the eldest son at 37, returned from a month-long journey to Augusta with news that would forever alter the perception of the family's activities. He announced to the small circle of acquaintances in Cartersville that he had finally found his perfect bride. Miss Sarah Pemberton, 19 years old, the daughter of a recently deceased blacksmith whose modest shop had provided essential services to Augusta's growing residential district. Jeremiah's description painted a picture of a young woman of modest means but exceptional virtue, eager to escape the difficult circumstances that had befallen her family following her father's death from consumption that had left her mother an invalid and the family facing imminent destitution. According to Jeremiah's carefully crafted narrative, Sarah had been working as a seamstress for wealthy families in Augusta when their paths crossed during a chance encounter at the city's main church. He described her as possessing the rare combination of genuine piety, domestic skills, and natural intelligence that he had sought unsuccessfully among the more privileged but less authentic young women of Georgia society. Her lack of extensive family connections, he explained, was actually advantageous, as it meant she could devote herself completely to creating a new life with the Pritchard family. What struck many as unusual was Jeremiah's insistence on complete privacy regarding his courtship and upcoming nuptials. He explained that Miss Pemberton was of such delicate sensibilities and refined nature that the excitement of meeting numerous new people simultaneously would overwhelm her gentle constitution. The wedding, he declared, would be a small, intimate affair attended only by immediate family members, with a celebration for the broader community to follow after she had properly settled into her new life and overcome the natural nervousness that affected sensitive young women when transplanted to unfamiliar surroundings. This explanation seemed plausible to most neighbors, as Southern society recognized and accommodated the supposed fragility of well-bred young women. The concept of female nervous disorders was widely accepted, and the idea that a young woman might require gradual introduction to new social circles was considered evidence of proper upbringing rather than cause for suspicion. On September 23, 1843, a covered carriage arrived at the Pritchard plantation just after sunset, timing that was explained as necessary to avoid the heat and dust of daytime travel that might have been harmful to a delicate constitution. Several neighbors later recalled seeing the vehicle, noting its heavy canvas covering that completely concealed the interior and the fact that it was driven by Tobias Hartwell rather than one of the family's usual slaves. The carriage bore no identifying marks and appeared to have been deliberately chosen for its anonymity rather than the elegant appearance typically associated with transporting a new bride to her future home. The carriage remained on the property for 3 days, during which time no visitors were permitted and no sounds of celebration reached the main road. This isolation was explained as necessary for Sarah to recover from the exhausting journey and to participate in private family ceremonies that would formally welcome her into the Pritchard lineage. Jeremiah mentioned that his bride was overwhelmed by the grandeur of the plantation and needed time to adjust to circumstances so different from her previous modest accommodations. Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, whose property bordered the Pritchard estate along a ridge that provided partial views of the main house and outbuildings, later testified in documents discovered in 1987 that she observed unusual activity during those 3 nights. Lanterns moved between the main house and what appeared to be a small outbuilding near the river, following patterns that seemed more consistent with purposeful work than with wedding celebrations. She distinctly heard the sound of heavy wagon wheels on the private road leading away from the plantation during the early morning hours of September 26th, accompanied by voices speaking in urgent whispers rather than the joyful conversations typically associated with wedding festivities. Most disturbing to Mrs. Fairchild was her observation that the sounds coming from the plantation during those 3 days included what seemed to be muffled crying or distress calls, though she later questioned her own perceptions, wondering if the sounds might have been nocturnal animals or the natural settling noises of unfamiliar buildings. The isolation of her own property meant that she had no opportunity to discuss these observations with other neighbors until much later, when similar patterns emerged following subsequent events. When Jeremiah next appeared in town, approximately 1 week later, he wore the demeanor of a man adjusting to married life, but explained that his new bride was suffering from a severe case of fever that had developed despite all precautions taken during her journey and settlement. He spoke with the concern of a devoted husband, describing symptoms that included weakness, disorientation, and an inability to tolerate visitors or any form of excitement that might exacerbate her delicate condition. Dr. Marcus Hewitt, the only physician within 20 miles, was not consulted about this mysterious illness, a decision that Jeremiah justified by explaining that Sarah had expressed absolute terror at the prospect of being examined by a male doctor, even one with impeccable professional credentials. This explanation seemed reasonable to a society that recognized female modesty as paramount, though Dr. Hewitt later admitted that he found it unusual for a family of the Pritchards' sophistication to rely entirely on home remedies for a serious illness. October passed, then November, with Jeremiah providing increasingly elaborate updates about his wife's condition to curious neighbors who inquired politely about when they might have the pleasure of meeting the new Mrs. Pritchard. First, it was a persistent fever that seemed to resist all attempts at treatment. Then, complications from a fall she had suffered while attempting to walk in the garden during a brief period of improvement. Later, he described a mysterious ailment that seemed to resist all medical intervention and required absolute isolation from any stimulation that might provoke a relapse. By December, even the most polite neighbors were beginning to ask pointed questions about why a woman who had been ill for 3 months had never been seen by a physician, and why no female relatives had been called upon to provide the nursing care that was typically considered essential for seriously ill women. Jeremiah's responses revealed the first cracks in what would later be understood as a carefully constructed facade. He claimed they had consulted with specialists in Atlanta who had prescribed treatments that required absolute isolation from all outside influences, including well-meaning visitors who might inadvertently introduce infectious elements or emotional disturbances that could prove fatal to someone in Sarah's precarious condition. The pattern established with Sarah Pemberton would be repeated with horrifying consistency over the next 20 years, each iteration refined and perfected to eliminate the small inconsistencies that might have aroused suspicion among more observant neighbors. Each of the 5 Pritchard sons would eventually announce engagements to young women encountered during their travels, always from distant locations, always from families of modest means or recent tragedy, always requiring complete privacy during their transition to married life. The second incident occurred in spring 1844, when Obadiah returned from Savannah with news of his engagement to Miss Charlotte Hendricks, the 18-year-old daughter of a dock worker who had drowned in an accident the previous winter while attempting to secure cargo during a violent storm. Obadiah's account of their courtship followed a similar pattern to his brother's, emphasizing Charlotte's vulnerability and isolation from protective family connections that might have interfered with their rapid engagement. According to Obadiah, Charlotte had been working in a boarding house that catered to traveling merchants when their paths crossed during his business dealings in Savannah's commercial district. He described her as possessing the rare combination of practical skills and moral character that made her superior to the pampered daughters of wealthy families who had never faced genuine hardship. Her father's tragic death had left her completely alone in the world, as her mother had died in childbirth, and she had no siblings or extended family capable of providing support. Charlotte's arrival followed the same mysterious pattern: a covered carriage arriving at dusk, 3 days of activity behind closed doors, then weeks of explanations about illness and recovery that prevented any social interactions with the broader community. The symptoms Obadiah described were eerily similar to those that had afflicted Sarah, suggesting either a remarkable coincidence or the presence of some environmental factor at the plantation that was harmful to young women's health. When Charlotte, too, succumbed to the same mysterious affliction that had claimed Sarah, occurring during the harsh winter months when travel was difficult and medical assistance was particularly limited, the few neighbors who dared to inquire were told that grief over losing 2 daughters-in-law in less than a year had driven the family to seek complete solitude. Cornelius and Constance were reportedly so devastated by this double tragedy that they could no longer bear to discuss the losses or to receive visitors who might inadvertently remind them of their grief. Dr. Hewitt's growing suspicions led him to make several unannounced visits to the plantation, hoping to offer medical assistance or at least professional guidance about preventing future tragedies that seemed to specifically affect young women who married into the Pritchard family. His attempts were met with polite but firm refusal by the overseers, who explained that the family's grief made them unable to receive visitors, and that any discussion of medical matters might trigger emotional episodes that could be harmful to Constance's already fragile mental state. His requests to examine death certificates or burial records were met with explanations that such documentation had been handled privately through connections in Atlanta, far from local jurisdiction, in accordance with the wishes of the deceased women who had supposedly expressed preferences for burial arrangements that honored their families of origin rather than their brief marriages into the Pritchard lineage. By 1845, a disturbing realization began to dawn on the more observant members of the community. Despite claiming to have lost 2 wives, both Jeremiah and Obadiah continued to behave like unmarried men in every respect, except their claims of widowhood. They attended social functions alone, never spoke of their deceased spouses with the grief-stricken demeanor expected of recent widowers, and showed no inclination toward the prolonged mourning periods that characterized Southern gentlemen who had lost beloved wives. Southern society had elaborate protocols for widowerhood that included specific clothing, social restrictions, and behavioral expectations that could last for years following a spouse's death. The Pritchard brothers seemed completely unaffected by these cultural requirements, participating in business dealings and social activities with an energy and focus that contradicted their claims of devastating personal loss. More troubling still was the discovery made by Reverend Samuel Coggins of the Cartersville Methodist Church when he attempted to locate records of the marriages he had supposedly performed for the Pritchard sons. His own meticulous records, which included every wedding ceremony conducted in Bartow County since 1840, contained no mention of either Sarah Pemberton or Charlotte Hendricks, despite clear recollections by multiple community members of the brothers' announcements regarding their engagements and marriages. When confronted about this discrepancy, Cornelius Pritchard produced a letter supposedly from Reverend Theodore Martindale of the First Baptist Church of Augusta, confirming that both ceremonies had been performed there at the specific request of the brides, who wished to be married in the same church where their deceased parents had exchanged vows. The letter, while bearing what appeared to be an official seal, seemed suspect to several educated members of the community who noted irregularities in its language, formatting, and theological references that seemed inconsistent with Baptist doctrine. Further investigation revealed that no Reverend Theodore Martindale was listed in the official records of Baptist churches in Augusta, and inquiries sent to church officials in that city produced no information about marriages involving members of the Pritchard family. These inconsistencies, however, were explained away through increasingly elaborate stories about private ceremonies conducted by visiting ministers who were friends of the deceased families rather than official church personnel. The third disappearance occurred in 1846 when Ezekiel announced his engagement to Miss Rebecca Thornton, supposedly the orphaned daughter of a Tennessee merchant who had lost his life and fortune in a steamboat accident on the Cumberland River. By this point, the pattern had become so predictable that Mrs. Fairchild began maintaining detailed notes about the activities she observed from her neighboring property, driven by suspicions that she was hesitant to voice openly without more concrete evidence. Her records, discovered alongside the trunk of family documents, provide chilling insights into what actually transpired during those mysterious 3-day periods that followed each wedding. She documented the arrival of supply wagons carrying unusual quantities of rope, canvas, and what appeared to be metal restraints or shackles that seemed inconsistent with normal plantation operations. She noted the presence of additional men beyond the usual overseers, including individuals who seemed to arrive by boat via the Etowah River under cover of darkness, and who departed by the same route before dawn. Most disturbing of all, Mrs. Fairchild recorded hearing sounds that completely contradicted the family's explanations of joyous wedding celebrations. Instead of music, laughter, and the typical festivities associated with Southern wedding traditions, she documented muffled cries that seemed to come from the direction of the river outbuilding and the sound of heavy objects being loaded onto wagons during the pre-dawn hours when honest people should be sleeping peacefully. Her notes also recorded changes in the behavior of the plantation's slaves during these periods, observing that they seemed frightened and avoided areas of the property where they normally worked, clustering instead near their quarters and refusing to venture out after dark, even when their duties might normally require it. This behavior was particularly significant because slaves on well-managed plantations typically maintained regular routines regardless of family events, and their obvious fear suggested that they were aware of activities that inspired genuine terror. The systematic nature of the Pritchard operation became clearer as more evidence accumulated over the years, revealing a level of organization and planning that went far beyond the opportunistic criminal activity that might have been expected from a family operating in isolation. Each son methodically worked through his assigned territory with the precision of a commercial enterprise. Jeremiah focused on Georgia and South Carolina. Obadiah handled coastal regions including Savannah and Charleston. Ezekiel covered Tennessee and northern Alabama, while Matthias and Caleb divided responsibilities for Virginia and North Carolina. Their method was devastatingly effective because it exploited the social vulnerabilities of the antebellum period with ruthless calculation. Young women who had lost parents or guardians often found themselves in desperate circumstances with few protective family connections and limited options for economic survival. The prospect of marriage to a wealthy plantation owner represented salvation from poverty, social disgrace, and the very real possibility of destitution that faced unmarried women without family support. The brothers had perfected their approach through careful observation and practice, developing personas that were specifically designed to appeal to vulnerable women, while avoiding the attention of protective family members or community leaders who might have investigated their backgrounds more thoroughly. They presented themselves as successful but lonely men, seeking genuine companionship rather than merely advantageous marriages based on social connections or financial considerations. They courted their targets with patient attention, often spending weeks in their target communities, establishing themselves as temporary residents with legitimate business interests that explained their presence and provided opportunities for repeated casual encounters that could develop into courtship. They attended local churches, participated in community activities, and cultivated relationships with local merchants and officials who could vouch for their character and financial standing. The key to their success lay in targeting women whose disappearance would generate minimal inquiry from authorities or family members. Orphans, daughters of deceased tradesmen, young women estranged from their families due to financial difficulties or social complications. These were individuals whose absence might be noted but rarely investigated with any thoroughness by overwhelmed local officials who had limited resources for pursuing cases involving adults who had apparently left voluntarily. In an era of limited communication and transportation, a woman who traveled to a distant state for marriage effectively vanished from her previous social circle, and the lack of reliable postal service or telegraph connections meant that months could pass before anyone became concerned about the absence of correspondence. The brothers exploited this communication gap by maintaining their courtships during periods when normal correspondence would be expected, then timing their marriages to coincide with natural breaks in communication patterns. What made the scheme particularly insidious was the careful attention paid to maintaining plausible explanations for every aspect of their behavior that might have aroused suspicion among neighbors or local authorities. The brothers never appeared desperate or hurried in their courtships. Instead, they cultivated reputations as discriminating men who refused to settle for anything less than perfect matches that met their exacting standards for virtue, intelligence, and domestic capability. This selective approach explained why they remained unmarried for so long, and why they traveled extensively in search of suitable wives, rather than settling for local women who might have been eager to marry into a wealthy family. Their apparent pickiness was interpreted as evidence of high moral standards rather than as a cover for criminal activity, and their willingness to invest significant time and money in their searches was seen as proof of their serious intentions. The plantation's isolation proved crucial to the operation's success, providing the privacy necessary for activities that would have been impossible to conceal in more accessible locations. The 2-mile distance from the main road, combined with the strategic positioning of slave quarters and outbuildings, ensured that any sounds or activities associated with their true purposes remained undetectable to casual observers who might have reported suspicious activities to local authorities. The 3 overseers functioned as essential accomplices who managed the logistics of the operation, while the family maintained their public facade of respectable planters pursuing legitimate agricultural and business interests. Their backgrounds, revealed through investigation decades later, showed connections to transportation networks and criminal enterprises that extended far beyond the borders of Georgia. Duncan Lowery's background, uncovered through records discovered in Tennessee, showed previous employment with shipping companies that transported cargo to Caribbean ports, specifically firms that specialized in moving goods that required discretion and rapid transportation without extensive documentation. His knowledge of river systems, port facilities, and international shipping schedules proved essential to the operation's success. Silas Vance had worked as a wagon driver along routes connecting Georgia to Tennessee and Virginia before joining the Pritchard operation, giving him intimate knowledge of roads, river crossings, and stopping points that could be used for moving people who needed to avoid official attention. His connections with tavern keepers, ferry operators, and other individuals who facilitated transportation along these routes provided the network necessary for moving victims efficiently and secretly. Tobias Hartwell possessed extensive knowledge of river navigation and had previously been employed by merchants who moved goods along the Etowah River to Alabama, where they connected with larger transportation networks that reached Mobile Bay and international shipping routes. His familiarity with tides, seasonal water levels, and the locations of safe anchorages allowed the operation to coordinate precise timing for transfers that minimized the risk of detection. By 1848, the operation had expanded to include a fourth marriage involving Matthias and a young woman named Elizabeth Harper, supposedly from Lynchburg, Virginia, whose story followed the established pattern, but with refinements that reflected the family's growing experience in managing potential complications. Elizabeth was described as the daughter of a tobacco merchant who had lost his business to a combination of crop failure and financial speculation, leaving her completely dependent on distant relatives who had made it clear that her presence was unwelcome. Matthias had supposedly encountered Elizabeth while conducting business related to tobacco purchases for a Virginia merchant who supplied Georgia planters with premium leaf for their personal use. Their courtship had developed over several months of correspondence before he finally proposed marriage and convinced her to travel to Georgia for what she believed would be a life of security and respectability as the wife of a successful planter. Mrs. Fairchild's continued surveillance revealed new details about the plantation's nighttime activities during this fourth incident, observations that provided crucial insights into the true nature of the operation. She observed the construction of what appeared to be a cellar or underground facility beneath the river outbuilding, accessible through a concealed entrance that required moving heavy stones and could only be detected by someone specifically looking for signs of excavation. Wagons began arriving with increasing frequency during the weeks preceding Elizabeth's arrival, always at night, carrying supplies that were immediately transferred to this underground facility. The materials included lumber, metal fittings, and what appeared to be chains or restraints that seemed completely inconsistent with normal plantation operations or even with the supposed wedding preparations that might have justified increased activity. The sounds she heard during the 3-day period following Elizabeth's wedding suggested that multiple people were being held in this hidden space, with voices that seemed to come from beneath the ground and movements that indicated the presence of several individuals, in addition to the supposed bride, who was allegedly recovering from travel fatigue and adjustment difficulties. The most chilling revelation came through the testimony of James Mullins, a former slave who escaped from the neighboring Williamson plantation in 1849, and later provided detailed information to Union forces during the Civil War, when escaped slaves were actively sought out for intelligence about Confederate operations and potential war crimes. Mullins had occasionally been hired by the Pritchards for seasonal work that required additional labor beyond what their small slave force could provide, giving him access to areas of the plantation that were normally off-limits to outsiders. According to Mullins' testimony, recorded by Union officials in a document that remained classified until 1963, the underground facility that Mrs. Fairchild had observed under construction contained cells designed to hold multiple individuals simultaneously, equipped with chains and restraints that suggested long-term imprisonment rather than temporary storage. The cells were lined with stone to muffle sound and fitted with drainage systems that could be used to wash away evidence of their use. Mullins described seeing young women in various states of distress being moved between the main house and this hidden dungeon, always under heavy guard by the 3 overseers who carried weapons and seemed prepared to use violence to maintain control. The women appeared to be drugged or weakened, moving slowly and showing signs of disorientation that suggested they were being kept in a chemically altered state to prevent escape attempts or resistance. More disturbing still, Mullins reported witnessing the loading of unconscious women onto boats that arrived at a private dock on the Etowah River during the darkest hours of the night, when even the most alert neighbors would be unlikely to observe activities along the water. These boats were operated by men who spoke in languages he didn't recognize and who conducted their business with the efficiency of an established commercial operation that had clearly been running for some time. The boats themselves were specially modified for their purpose, with concealed compartments below deck that could hide human cargo from any casual inspection by river authorities or other boat traffic that might have reason to come alongside. The modifications included ventilation systems that would keep occupants alive during extended river journeys and restraint systems that would prevent escape attempts even if the occupants regained consciousness during transport. The scope of the Pritchard network became apparent when Mullins described conversations he had overheard between Cornelius and visitors who arrived periodically to conduct what appeared to be financial transactions related to the regular shipment of merchandise to markets in New Orleans, Charleston, and even locations beyond American borders, where American women commanded premium prices due to their education and appearance. These conversations revealed that the operation was part of a larger network that included similar facilities in other states, all coordinated by a central authority that matched victims with buyers based on specific requirements and preferences. Numbers were discussed with the clinical detachment of livestock trading, quantities available for immediate delivery, prices based on age and physical characteristics, delivery schedules that coordinated with shipping routes and seasonal demand fluctuations. Mullins's testimony provided the first clear evidence that the Pritchard family was operating a sophisticated human trafficking network disguised as a series of failed marriages, with the wedding ceremonies serving as psychological tools to control their victims during the initial period of captivity. The elaborate marriage rituals made the women compliant during the crucial first days when they might otherwise have attempted to escape or signal for help, believing that they were participating in legitimate matrimonial ceremonies that would lead to the security and respectability they desperately sought. The 3-day periods following each wedding were actually preparation phases during which the victims were gradually drugged with increasing doses of laudanum and other substances that would make them manageable during transport while keeping them alive and relatively undamaged for eventual sale. The underground facility served as a processing center where multiple women could be kept simultaneously while arrangements were made for their transfer to buyers in distant locations. The timing of these transfers was coordinated with the arrival of boats that followed regular schedules along the river system, connecting with larger vessels in Mobile Bay that could transport human cargo to international destinations without attracting attention from American authorities who were primarily concerned with preventing the importation of slaves rather than monitoring the export of free citizens who appeared to be traveling voluntarily. Dr. Hewitt's suspicions had been entirely correct, but his attempts to investigate were systematically thwarted by a network of corruption that extended far beyond Bartow County and included local officials who were either intimidated or purchased through generous contributions to their political campaigns and personal financial difficulties. The few who persisted in asking uncomfortable questions found themselves facing mysterious legal troubles, business complications, or social ostracism that diverted their attention from the Pritchard family's activities. Sheriff William Crenshaw, who had initially shown interest in investigating the unusual number of deaths among young women associated with the Pritchard family, suddenly announced his intention to retire early after his eldest son was arrested on trumped-up charges of horse theft that carried a potential death sentence. The charges were quietly dropped after Crenshaw ceased his inquiries, and his son left the state shortly thereafter, apparently convinced that his safety depended on his father's cooperation with powerful interests that preferred to avoid official scrutiny. By 1850, the Pritchard operation had processed an estimated 23 women, with each of the 5 sons having claimed multiple wives, who had all succumbed to various mysterious ailments that seemed to specifically affect young women who married into the family. The family's wealth had grown exponentially during this period, far exceeding what their agricultural activities could have generated, even with the most favorable cotton prices and efficient management. Their prosperity was attributed by neighbors to shrewd cotton trading, land speculation, and business connections in Atlanta and Savannah that provided access to investment opportunities unavailable to less sophisticated planters. The family's apparent business acumen was used to explain their frequent travels, their connections with shipping companies, and their ability to maintain cash reserves during periods when other planters were struggling with credit problems and market fluctuations. The turning point came in 1851 when Caleb, the youngest brother, made a crucial error that began to unravel the entire operation. His target was Miss Amanda Rutherford, a 16-year-old from Richmond whose uncle had recently died in a factory accident that left her orphaned and facing immediate destitution. Unlike previous victims, Amanda had maintained correspondence with a close friend in Virginia who became alarmed when letters suddenly stopped arriving after Amanda's supposed marriage. Margaret Sinclair, Amanda's friend, was the daughter of a prominent Richmond merchant who had business connections throughout the South and sufficient resources to pursue inquiries when she became convinced that something terrible had happened to her friend. Her father, Thomas Sinclair, was not easily intimidated by vague explanations or official indifference, and he used his business network to make inquiries that reached persons who had long harbored suspicions about the Pritchard family, but had previously lacked sufficient motivation to pursue their concerns. The investigation that Thomas Sinclair initiated was conducted by private investigators who were not subject to the local political pressures that had previously protected the Pritchard operation. These investigators discovered inconsistencies in the family's stories, traced the backgrounds of the three overseers, and uncovered evidence of the river transport network that connected the plantation to international trafficking routes. The investigation that followed Amanda Rutherford's disappearance revealed the full horror of what had been occurring at the Pritchard plantation for nearly a decade, exposing a network of corruption and criminal enterprise that shocked even experienced law enforcement officials who thought they had seen every form of human depravity that existed in the antebellum South. Federal marshals, accompanied by Georgia state officials and representatives from Virginia who were investigating Amanda's disappearance, arrived at the estate on November 15, 1851, armed with warrants that had been carefully prepared through federal channels to prevent advance warning through the local officials who had been compromised by years of bribes and intimidation. The raid was coordinated to coincide with the arrival of one of the regular transport boats, allowing investigators to capture not only the Pritchard family and their immediate accomplices, but also representatives of the broader network who were present to conduct business. The timing had been determined through surveillance that revealed the regular patterns of river traffic that connected the plantation to the larger trafficking operation. What they discovered in the underground facility beneath the river outbuilding defied the worst expectations of even experienced law enforcement officials who had investigated numerous criminal enterprises throughout the southeastern states. The cellar contained evidence of systematic imprisonment and processing of human beings on an industrial scale, including restraints designed for different body sizes, drugging equipment that could maintain precise chemical control over multiple victims simultaneously, and documentation that revealed the scope of the trafficking network with horrifying clarity. The facility itself was a masterpiece of criminal engineering, designed with drainage systems that could efficiently dispose of evidence, ventilation that prevented suffocation while maintaining sound isolation, and multiple escape routes that would allow operators to flee if the main entrance was compromised. The walls were lined with soundproofing materials that completely muffled any cries for help, and the ceiling was reinforced to support the weight of the building above while concealing any evidence of the underground activities. Among the most damning evidence were detailed records maintained by Cornelius Pritchard himself, documenting each victim with the cold precision of a businessman tracking inventory for maximum profitability. Names, ages, physical descriptions, points of origin, dates of arrival and destinations were all meticulously recorded alongside financial notations that revealed the profits generated by each transaction. The record showed prices ranging from $300 to $800 per victim, depending on age, appearance, and perceived education level. The documentation included correspondence with buyers in multiple countries, showing that the network extended to markets in the Caribbean, South America, and North Africa, where American women commanded premium prices due to their perceived refinement and education. Letters discussed specific requests from buyers for women with particular characteristics, and detailed invoices showed the systematic nature of an operation that treated human beings as commercial commodities. The record showed that victims were transported by boat down the Etowah River to its confluence with the Coosa, then along established waterways to Mobile Bay, where they were transferred to ships bound for international destinations. The journey was coordinated with precise timing to minimize the risk of detection, and weigh stations along the route provided secure holding facilities where victims could be kept if scheduling problems required delays. The three overseers were arrested along with the family members, and their testimony revealed additional details about the operation's scope that had previously been unknown even to investigators who thought they understood the full extent of the criminal enterprise. Tobias Hartwell admitted to personally escorting over 30 women to transfer points where they were handed over to ship captains who specialized in human cargo and who maintained the documentation necessary to transport their victims as legitimate passengers or indentured servants. Duncan Lowry confessed to maintaining safe houses along river routes where victims could be held if transportation schedules required delays, and he provided detailed information about the network of corrupt officials who had been paid to ignore irregular activities or to provide false documentation when necessary. His testimony revealed that the corruption extended to customs officials in Mobile, ship captains who falsified passenger manifests, and even foreign officials who facilitated the entry of trafficking victims into countries where slavery remained legal. The most shocking revelation came from Silas Vance, who provided evidence that the Pritchard network was part of a larger organization operating throughout the southeastern United States, with similar operations in Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Tennessee. All of these facilities were coordinated by a central authority based in New Orleans that matched victims with buyers based on specific requirements and preferences, maintaining catalogs of available merchandise that were circulated among potential customers. The central organization provided financing for individual operations, supplied transportation and security services, and maintained the corrupt networks necessary to operate without interference from law enforcement. The profits were shared according to a complex formula that rewarded operators who could provide high-quality victims while maintaining the security necessary to avoid detection. Physical evidence found on the property included personal belongings from dozens of women, carefully preserved as both trophies of successful transactions and insurance against potential problems with buyers who might claim that merchandise had been misrepresented. Jewelry, clothing, letters, and even locks of hair were organized in a macabre collection that allowed investigators to identify victims whose names appeared in the business records and to connect specific individuals to their ultimate fates. The underground facility also contained evidence of the drug compounds used to maintain victim compliance during the processing periods, including detailed recipes and dosage instructions that showed the sophisticated understanding of chemistry necessary to keep victims unconscious or severely disoriented without causing death that would reduce their market value. Laudanum, chloroform, and other substances were mixed in precise proportions that had been refined through experimentation over years of operation. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery that the wedding ceremonies were conducted with genuine religious formality, complete with fabricated marriage certificates and detailed documentation designed to provide legal cover for the operation, while serving the psychological purpose of making victims compliant during their initial captivity. The psychological impact on victims who believed they were entering into legitimate marriages added an additional layer of cruelty to their exploitation, as they initially cooperated with their captors in the belief that they were beginning new lives as respected wives. The marriage certificates were created using stolen official seals and forged signatures from legitimate ministers, and the documentation was sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection by local officials who might have had reason to question the legitimacy of the ceremonies. The family maintained detailed records of which false identities had been used for which ceremonies, allowing them to maintain consistent stories when questioned about their supposed marriages. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Pritchard plantation intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The investigation also revealed that the family had been experimenting with new methods of control and transportation, including the development of portable restraint systems that could be used during river transport and chemical compounds that would render victims unconscious for extended periods without requiring constant monitoring. These innovations were being shared with other operations in the network, showing the systematic effort to improve efficiency and reduce risks. The trial of the Pritchard family became one of the most sensational criminal cases in antebellum Georgia, though extensive efforts were made by powerful interests to limit public knowledge of the full details that might have implicated additional prominent citizens whose reputations and businesses depended on maintaining secrecy about their involvement in or knowledge of the trafficking network. The scope of the operation had grown so large and involved so many individuals in positions of authority that complete disclosure threatened to undermine confidence in the entire system of law enforcement and political governance. Cornelius Pritchard and his 5 sons were convicted on multiple charges including kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, and operating a criminal enterprise, though the specific charges were carefully worded to avoid detailed description of the international scope of their activities. The prosecutors focused on the local crimes that could be proven through physical evidence and witness testimony, while avoiding testimony that might have revealed the involvement of federal officials or prominent businessmen in other states. However, the sentences they received were far lighter than the crimes warranted, reflecting the influence they maintained even after their arrest, and the fear among officials that harsh sentences might prompt the defendants to reveal information about their accomplices that could destabilize the political and economic structures of multiple states. 3 of the sons received prison terms of less than 10 years, while Cornelius and the other 2 were sentenced to 15 years in the Georgia State Penitentiary. The 3 overseers, lacking the family's financial resources and social connections, received more severe punishments that reflected their dispensability to the powerful interests who had profited from the operation. Tobias Hartwell was sentenced to 25 years, while Duncan Lowry and Silas Vance each received 20 years in conditions that were deliberately harsh compared to the accommodations provided for the Pritchard family members. All three overseers died in prison before completing their sentences, under circumstances that family descendants later claimed were suspicious and that suggested deliberate action to prevent them from revealing additional information about the network's operations. Hartwell died of apparent food poisoning after only 2 years in prison, while Lowry and Vance succumbed to illnesses that seemed to specifically affect prisoners who had been involved in trafficking cases. The fate of the 47 documented victims was never fully resolved, despite efforts by federal authorities and international law enforcement agencies to locate and repatriate survivors who might still be alive in foreign countries. The investigation revealed that most victims had been transported to locations where slavery remained legal and where American women were valued for forced labor in agricultural operations, domestic service, and other forms of exploitation that made recovery extremely difficult. Efforts to trace the victims were hampered by the international scope of the trafficking network, the reluctance of various governments to acknowledge the existence of markets for enslaved American citizens, and the sophisticated documentation systems that had been used to provide false identities for the victims. Many women had been given new names and backgrounds that made it nearly impossible to connect them to their original identities. A few women were eventually located and returned to the United States, but most had either died in captivity or had been moved so many times between different owners that tracing their whereabouts became impossible. The testimony of the few survivors who were recovered provided horrifying details about the conditions they had endured and the systematic brutality of the operations that had purchased them from the Pritchard network. The Pritchard plantation was seized by the state and sold at auction, with proceeds supposedly designated for victim compensation and the support of families who had lost daughters, sisters, and wives to the trafficking operation. However, accounting irregularities and legal complications meant that very little money ever reached the intended recipients, and most families received no compensation for their losses. The property changed hands multiple times before being abandoned during the Civil War, when Union forces burned the main house and most outbuildings as part of Sherman's march to the sea. The underground facility was sealed with explosives to prevent its use by Confederate forces, and the site was left to deteriorate until it became the overgrown ruin that exists today. Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild's detailed records proved crucial in documenting the operation's timeline and methods, providing evidence that allowed prosecutors to establish the systematic nature of the crimes and to connect specific incidents to the broader pattern of trafficking. Her testimony revealed that she had suspected the truth for years, but had been afraid to speak openly due to threats made by the overseers and the family's apparent connections to local law enforcement officials who might have been compromised. Her courage in finally coming forward, prompted by the federal investigation that offered protection from local retaliation, helped ensure that at least some measure of justice was achieved and that the full scope of the operation was documented for historical record. Her detailed observations provided crucial corroboration for the testimony of James Mullins and other witnesses whose credibility might otherwise have been questioned. The case established important precedents for prosecuting human trafficking operations and led to enhanced cooperation between state and federal authorities in investigating crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. New laws were passed requiring better documentation of marriages and more stringent oversight of transportation operations that might be used to move victims across state lines. However, the full extent of the network was never uncovered, and historians believe that similar operations continued in other locations with greater attention to avoiding detection. The disruption caused by the Civil War destroyed many records and scattered the participants, making it impossible to pursue comprehensive investigation of the broader criminal enterprise. The trunk discovered in 1987 contained additional documents that revealed connections between the Pritchard network and international criminal organizations that specialized in various forms of human exploitation, including correspondence with buyers, financial records showing the profits generated by the operation, and detailed instructions for managing victims during transport and processing. These documents suggested that the Georgia operation was merely one component of a vast enterprise that operated throughout the Americas during the mid-19th century. taking advantage of political instability, limited law enforcement capabilities, and the social vulnerabilities created by economic disruption and family displacement. Modern historians, who have studied the case, estimate that the actual number of victims may have exceeded 100 women when unreported cases and affiliated operations are considered. The psychological impact on survivors and their families reverberates through multiple generations, representing one of the most systematic and calculated crimes in American history that exploited the social expectations and vulnerabilities of young women seeking security through marriage. The Pritchard name was indeed erased from official county records, not through oversight, but through deliberate action by authorities who wished to avoid ongoing scrutiny of the corruption that had allowed such crimes to continue undetected for nearly a decade. The family's wealth, built on human suffering, was dispersed through legal proceedings that remain sealed to this day, though evidence suggests that much of it was transferred to accounts in foreign banks that specialized in managing assets of questionable origin. What remains of the plantation serves as a stark reminder that evil often hides behind facades of respectability and social prominence, exploiting the trust and desperation of vulnerable individuals who seek security and love but find only betrayal and exploitation. The rolling hills that once concealed systematic horror now stand empty, bearing silent witness to the 47 young women who sought love and security, but found only betrayal and exploitation at the hands of those who viewed human beings as commodities to be bought and sold. This story demonstrates how predators exploit society's most vulnerable members, and how institutional failures can enable crimes of shocking magnitude when corruption undermines the systems designed to protect the innocent. The Pritchard case reminds us that historical horror often stems not from supernatural forces, but from the calculated cruelty of those who view human beings as objects to be manipulated for profit and pleasure. The systematic nature of their operation, the sophisticated methods they employed, and the extensive corruption they maintained show how criminal enterprises can flourish when social institutions fail to protect the vulnerable and when economic incentives create markets for human exploitation. The case provides crucial insights into the social and economic factors that enable trafficking operations and the importance of maintaining vigilant oversight of institutions that are supposed to protect citizens from such predation. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you suspect that similar networks operated in other parts of the country during this dark period in American history? The evidence suggests that the Pritchard operation was part of a much larger system that we may never fully understand. Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about how such crimes could have been prevented and what lessons we can learn from this tragic chapter in our history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates true stories that illuminate the darkest chapters of our past. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another forgotten crime that shocked a nation.